What's going on, everyone? Anthony from Chronometer Check here, and today we're reviewing a watch that I'm actually quite excited to review, and that's because it's literally one of, if not the first mechanical watch I've ever owned. That's right, today we're reviewing the Invicta Pro Diver 89280B. So how did I end up with this beauty? Well, I'm sure like many of you, this actually did kick off my addiction, my hobby, my collection, as I like to call it, to justify it to myself. But this did kick off the spending way more than I probably can afford, the time spent researching about and learning about watches that I probably shouldn't have spent. It just really kicked off the addiction for me. So how did I get into this? I was actually looking for a present for my dad years and years ago. I believe it was for a Christmas present. So I thought, you know what, why not get him a watch? Humble guy, wears a metal G-Shock pretty much day in, day out. So I wanted to learn more about watches, what makes them good, and then hopefully get him, you know, a nice gift. So I learned all about watches, all about mechanical watches, and, you know, because I kind of saw that as sort of the next level of like a basic, like a G-Shock. Not that G-Shocks are basic by any means, but sort of the next level for someone like my dad who, you know, wore a G-Shock, a digital watch, 24/7, and maybe something that, you know, I thought might be a little bit more interesting. Well, it turns out he wasn't interested. And you know what? I do appreciate the fact that he was honest and told me. He really likes his G-Shock. What can I say? He's a one-watch kind of guy for the most part. But despite the fact that my attempt at giving a gift has failed, I ended up with a very nice watch. And to be honest, I kind of wanted to keep it all along, I'm not going to lie. I was very, very fascinated at this point about mechanical watches and how they operate without needing a battery and, you know, the engineering behind it. So all very, very fascinating to me. At the time, I also, you know, very much liked the Rolex Submariner style. I think, you know, when you are getting into watches, it is kind of one of the most recognizable and one that I think a lot of people who are getting into watches kind of strive for in some form or another. And I was maybe 20 years old, so you know, I definitely couldn't afford a Submariner at that time in my life. But the next best thing for me was something that, you know, looked very similar and got very high praise for, you know, how well it's built for the money, its value, etc. And I must say, you know, the Invicta Pro Diver, it definitely lives up to the hype. Now, Invicta as a brand does get, you know, a ton of hate because it does make some very obnoxiously large and garish watches, you know, some bright yellow, bright gold, just super flashy, giant dinner plate size watches that are super in your face. And then on top of that, they kind of mark up the prices to ridiculous prices and then, you know, pretend that they're on sale for a huge discount and then try to sell it as like a luxury watch to people who don't really know any better, to people who, to be honest, kind of fall victim to the marketing of Invicta a lot of the times. But with that said, Invicta does have a couple of gems, including this one, that kind of, you know, sneaks past the goalie in a way, in the sense that this one actually, you know, despite the fact that it is, you know, a very obvious Rolex Submariner homage, it does kind of stand on its own in terms of a very good value proposition. So one last thing before we dig a little deeper into the Invicta Pro Diver, just some shopkeeping. Don't forget to hit that like button if you do want to see more, really helps me out. Subscribe if this is your first time. Quick wrist check. Today I'm wearing the Citizen Nighthawk Promaster. Battery is unfortunately dying, so you can see the second hand kind of pitifully sweeping away. I do need to get that changed out, but regardless. So a couple of things I really like about the Invicta Pro Diver. One, it's a 200 meter, true 200 meter water resistant automatic dive watch for under $100. Now that in itself is a mouthful, but it's quite a rare feat. I mean, there aren't many watches that compete with those specifications, and especially not at this price. This watch generally could be found for under $100, but even at $200 or $300, it can sometimes be hard to find an automatic watch with that type of water resistance. Now, and Orient, just to name a few, do it, but not at this price point. I mean, it's very, very rare to find it for under $100. And with that said, it is a relatively well-built watch in general. Part of that is actually the movement inside, right? So it is housing a Seiko NH35a movement, which is, again, Seiko built. It's essentially equivalent to Seiko's 4R35 movement, except it's unbranded. They tend to use it in a lot of micro brands. People love to use it in mods because it is so reliable. It's such an affordable workhorse Japanese movement, and it's made by Seiko, so you know it's very reliable. Of course, Invicta can't just let bygones be bygones. They got to slap on their signature yellow onto the automatic rotor wheel, which, by the way, for this is your first time learning about mechanical watches, the rotor is actually what allows an automatic watch to wind sort of automatically when it's on your wrist, because that rotor will wind around and then charge up the mainspring of the movement itself and then power the watch. But very good basic entry-level movement. Has all the features you would really want. I mean, it has an accuracy, I think, of between -20 to +40, if I'm not mistaken, but they tend to be much more accurate than that, generally between plus or minus 10 seconds per day, especially once regulated, which is not hard to do. It also has some very nice additional features like hand winding, which means instead of just wearing it on your wrist to power it up, you can also wind it up from the crown itself. Actually feels pretty decent. Doesn't feel terribly cheap. And it also has hacking, which is a little bit of another kind of like advanced, complicated feature where you pull the crown out and the second hand will stop. And now this just lets you get a little bit more of an accurate time set when you do go to set the time. Now this is a feature that, again, is kind of rare to see in such an affordable watch, which is partially what makes this such a well-built watch for the money. Now, taking a look at the design of the dial itself, there's a couple of things that some people might love, some people might hate. We see this watch in particular has a blue, almost navy purplish sunburst dial. And at first, this is something that kind of struck me the wrong way a little bit, how almost purple the dial looks. However, it doesn't look bad, and especially when you put together the whole package, it kind of works. Somehow it kind of works. It is a very, very glassy dial, which is something that I liked right off the bat because I was used to dealing with kind of matte dials. Even after this, even after I owned a couple of other watches after this, it's very rare to see such nice glossy dials. So to me, it still always stuck out as something that was a little bit different. The indices are applied rather nicely. In this case, they are gold plated. Obviously, at this price, you're not going to get solid gold, but it still looks decent enough. Now, a complaint I had when I actually first got the watch was that the indices were a little small. I wanted them to be a little bit larger. I think that just came from a place of, coming previously from like a big gold fossil watch where I wanted a little bit more flash or a little bit more bling, which is kind of hilarious because this watch has plenty of flash and bling, so much so that the included two-tone bracelet, I had to take it off and put it on this suede strap just to kind of break it up a little bit, make it a little less flashy, a little bit more blingy, which is, kind of the direction I went as my sort of tastes evolved over time and I tried so many other watches and got to learn more about what I actually like. But regardless, overall, I do think the size of the indices kind of, really help the watch to kind of not be too loud in a sense, even though, yeah, it is a loud watch. The Invicta logo at 12 o'clock, you either love it or you hate it. Actually, not that many people love it. You probably hate it. Again, it's just one of those things, super duper flashy. And you know what? It's two-tone, so it's gonna be flashy. If you're getting a two-tone watch, even if it's Invicta, you know what you're signing up for. There is a little more of a streamlined, simple model that is black and silver, a black bezel insert, all silver case, silver bezel. If you want something a little toned down, that's a good option to go for. Now, the Cyclops at 3 o'clock is something that people just tend to hate. And personally, I think it's a huge downside of this watch because yes, Cyclops, they do tend to be very, very polarizing. People tend to either, not mind them or just really dislike them in general. But in this case, I think it looks really awful because the whole point of the Cyclops is to magnify the date complication underneath. Now, this Cyclops clearly doesn't magnify the date, too much. So that's just the sign of a very, very cheap Cyclops. And in that case, if you're going to do something cheap, just don't do it at all, in my opinion. But of course, they did want to kind of emulate the Rolex Submariner style. So that's, of course, why it's on there. And finally, a couple of other things about the design of the watch and the dial itself. We do have a bunch of text at 6 o'clock, which is a little bit too much for some. But again, kind of in that Rolex Submariner-esque style, does show the water resistance and etc. The handset is decent, Mercedes hands. We do see on the second hand, the counterbalance is also the Invicta logo, which I know some people do hate so much. They actually go as far to clip it off with nail clippers, which is something you could definitely do. Speaking of taking off, you can also take off the Cyclops with a lighter if you so choose. And then don't forget to clean off the crystal with some Windex or something after that. Crown, signed crown, gold in the case of this two-tone. Decent enough, feels good, has good has good teeth to it to allow you to give a good grip while hand winding. Speaking of signed, another thing that people tend to hate or overlook about the Invicta Pro Diver is the fact that it's engraved on the side. I mean, really not the biggest deal, but hey, one thing I do like is that it you know, by engraving it on the side, it does tell me that it's not really trying to pass off as a Rolex, even though obviously it's, you know, completely styled like the Rolex Submariner. It's not trying to be a fake. So I do like the fact that it really kind of distinguishes itself by saying, hey, this is an Invicta watch. This is not a Rolex Submariner fake watch. And of course, this does have a coin edge bezel, which honestly, while it is a little bit hard to get a grip because it is downward sloping, it doesn't have the worst action. Now, it does have a really kind of nasty sound. It just doesn't sound like a quality bezel whatsoever, but 120 click, a unidirectional bezel, obviously used to tell the time in dives, but you know, more frequently I use it to check the time of like a pizza, frozen pizza in the oven or something like that. And the overall finishing is not great, but it's definitely not bad by any means. I mean, it's just okay. Brushed on the top, polished on the sides. There's not too much attention to detail paid to the finish. You know, it's just a very clear and harsh distinction between the top and sides of the case. It's not the best finished. It is a little bit rough, a little bit sharp, and there's really no kind of dynamic interest to the case. I mean, you know, obviously there's a lot going on elsewhere, but the case is definitely something that's just kind of bland, and it's just kind of it's there. Now, one thing I do like about the case is how deep the dial actually sits underneath it and underneath the crystal. We do see this stainless steel chapter ring, just like in the Rolex Submariner, and it does help to add some nice depth to the watch and just add some nice visual interest because it, you know, adds some depth. It adds some layering to the watch that otherwise isn't there. Bezel insert, of course, aluminum. We do have a lume pip at 12 o'clock. It actually lines up rather decently, better than some of Seiko's quality control, so I will give it that. And yes, like I said, I did remove the included bracelet. It was okay, good, not great. It was brushed on the outer links, polished on the center, a little too flashy for me. It was hollow, it was jangly. I don't miss it one bit, to be perfectly honest with you. But it was fine for what it was. I just tend to prefer it on something a little bit different. And I think this two-stitch sort of vintage style of suede strap does kind of play into the vintage style of sub that this Submariner that this is homaging, you know, with the acrylic bezel and all that. It's just kind of tones it down a little bit, enough that I could actually wear it and don't mind. So let's talk dimensions and comfort and how does this wear on the wrist. So this is a 40mm dive watch, which is a very, very nice sweet spot probably for most people. It does have a 46 or just over a 46mm lug to lug, so it does wear a little bit larger than, you know, some 40mm watches, but it's definitely not a large watch. It's one that could fit on many, many different wrist sizes without problem. It does have a 20mm lug width, so you should have no problem finding replacement straps. Any 20mm strap, we'll have a link in the description below. One problem, it is a little thick, coming in at about 14mm. Again, you know, it does have a lot of depth to the dial and from the crystal to the dial, so that is kind of nice in a way, but it does add some thickness, which is not great. Speaking of crystal, the crystal is just mineral, which is definitely a bummer. Could get scratched, as you can see. Not really scratched yet. We do see some scratches on my bezel, my aluminum bezel, but that's just one of the things that happens to aluminum as opposed to a ceramic bezel over time. And I have worn this watch quite a bit, as you know, it was my first mechanical watch. So let's throw this watch on the wrist and see how it wears. So here we have the watch on my just over 6.5 inch wrist. As you can see, a little bit tall and chunky, like I said, from that rather thick thickness, but the depth of the dial does add a nice, cool little visual element and some visual interest. Overall, it doesn't, you know, it's not too large. The lug to lug doesn't go past the span of my wrist, which is of course, you know, what you're kind of looking for when you're trying to find a watch that fits you well, but it's a good average size that I think will fit quite a large variety of wrists rather well. And then finally, when we talk about, you know, the Invicta Pro Diver, we got to talk about price and value, because that's really one of the things that, combined with the build quality, combined with the movement used, combined with the water resistance, is what makes this such an excellent sort of starter watch and just value watch for the money. Coming in at pretty much always under $100, there's very, very little competition for a 200-meter water-resistant dive watch that uses a Seiko NH35 movement. I mean, if you went to buy all these parts separately, you would have a very, very hard time even trying to build a watch that comes remotely close to this. You know, if you put the parts together, it would cost, you know, probably $250 at least. And in this price range, you're really only competing with watches like, you know, Seiko's older Seiko 5 watches, which fantastic watches, by the way. But if you are looking for that kind of, you know, Rolex inspired watch or something a little more flashy, or something with 200 meters of water resistance, the Invicta Pro Diver under $100. This one kind of floats around 70, 75, 65, depending on deals you find and whatnot. This is actually a very, very good value. And I think a great watch, you know, maybe not for someone who has a collection already, but for someone who's really starting their collection or just wants to see if a mechanical watch is even for them without having to invest a lot of money that you might not be able to recoup. I think the Invicta Pro Diver is still one of the best value divers on the market that you can absolutely get. Link to this piece will be in the description. Let me know what you think about the Invicta Pro Diver in the comments below. I'm sure, like myself, you know, many of you have used this watch to kind of start off your collection, your addiction, your hobby. It just is that sort of gateway entry-level piece that, you know, just really does it for a lot of people. And if you do have any questions, feel free to let me know. Don't forget to hit that like button, feed the YouTube algorithm, really helps me out, and subscribe for more watch content to come. Thanks for watching. Until next time.